All right. So today we're going to be looking at one of the most talked about conflicts in recent times, I guess you could say. And that's the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
We see headlines about it every single day.
Yeah.
But, do we really know what led to this crisis?
It's easy to kind of get lost in that daily news cycle, I think, without really considering like the deeper context historically and where this all comes from.
Totally. And so for this deep dive, we're going to kind of go beyond the headlines a little bit and explore a narrative that's not always looked at or talked about. And that is the role of the U.S. and NATO expansion in the lead up to the 2022 invasion. And joining me for this is an expert, and we're going to be using Jeffrey Sachs as kind of our guide for this conversation.
Yeah, Sachs is someone with really interesting credentials for this because he was an advisor to Gorbachev and Yeltsin and Kuchma. So these were leaders that were really dealing with the transition out of the Soviet period. So I think it gives him a really unique perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
On this whole thing.
And Sachs actually argues that this war, as tragic as it is, was avoidable.
Yeah.
And that it actually has roots going all the way back to the fall of the Soviet Union and a series of broken promises from the West. One of the things that he says that I thought was really fascinating is he kind of makes this point that the U.S. Seems to have this preference for clear enemies rather than neutral countries. And he even has this anecdote where he says that essentially the U.S. hates neutrality.
Yeah, why would that be?
Yeah, why would that be? It's really interesting. I mean, does that, you wonder if it gives them some sort of strategic advantage to kind of have the world divided into these clear-cut alliances and oppositions.
It makes you think, about what the foreign policy goals are really. Like, what are they looking to accomplish? And it ties into this issue of broken promises, I think. Sachs talks about how in 1990, James Baker, who was the Secretary of State at the time, made a promise to Gorbachev. And he said that if the USSR allowed for German reunification, that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward.
Huh. That seems like a pretty significant promise to make.
Yeah, it does. And it's interesting because there were a number of people at the time who said, this is not a good idea to expand NATO.
Right.
This could have some consequences. We should be very careful about doing this.
But did they uphold that promise?
No, really. No. So despite those warnings, NATO expansion did begin in the mid-90s under Clinton. And so that, this is directly contradicting the assurances that were given to Gorbachev, and it's been a source of tension ever since.
Wow. So they went back on their word.
Yeah.
What was Russia's response to that at the time?
Well, it's interesting because Putin, in the early years of his leadership, actually had a fairly pro-Western stance. And he actually pleaded with the West to halt NATO expansion. He was expressing concerns about Russia's security.
So he wasn't always the kind of this adversary that we see him as today.
Yep. I think initially he was coming at it from a very different place, but his concerns were just ignored and NATO continued its expansion eastward.
Wow.
And Sachs points out that the U.S. was operating under this assumption of a unipolar world after the Cold War. And so they were the sole superpower.
Right.
And they were essentially calling the shots.
I see. So there wasn't really room for neutrality in that kind of worldview.
Exactly.
So how do we go from kind of these broken promises and this attitude from the U.S. to the brink of war? Like, how does that happen?
Well, I think a pivotal moment is the 2008 Bucharest summit. And this is where President Bush at the time pushed for both Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. And this was really controversial. Even some European leaders were saying, this is not a good idea.
Wow.
We need to be careful about provoking Russia.
Right.
So even within the Western alliance, there was a recognition that this could be a dangerous move.
So they knew the risks, but they decided to push forward anyway.
Yeah, and this really sets the stage then for the 2014 Ukrainian Revolution, which was this period of intense political upheaval.
Right.
And Sachs argues that the U.S. played a very active role in overthrowing the then president Yanukovych, who had actually maintained a neutral stance between Russia and the West.
Wow. Wait, are you saying that the U.S. was directly involved in regime change in Ukraine?
Yeah, Sachs is very clear about this.
It's a pretty serious accusation.
Yeah, and he points to this piece of evidence, which is this intercepted phone call between Victoria Nuland, who was the Assistant Secretary of State at the time,
right? Yeah.
And Jeffrey Piatt, who was the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
What were they talking about?
They were discussing who should be in the next Ukrainian government.
Oh, wow.
They were actually naming names and strategizing about how to install these people in power. So it's a pretty shocking revelation when you think about it.
Yeah, it really kind of changes the picture of what was happening there during that revolution.
Yeah, and it makes you think about just how much influence the U.S. has in the internal affairs of other countries, even when they're saying, oh, we're promoting democracy.
Yeah.
You know?
It makes you wonder.
It makes you wonder what's really going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, it really raises some questions, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So after the 2014 revolution is that when we really start to see the conflict intensify in eastern Ukraine.
That's right, because, you know, the revolution with this very public backing from the U.S. that further inflames the tensions with Russia.
Okay.
And remember, eastern Ukraine has a significant Russian-speaking population with close ties to Russia. And so they're feeling very alienated by this new government in Kyiv, which they see as being illegitimate and hostile to their interests.
So the revolution kind of creates this powder keg in eastern Ukraine.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And sets the stage for the conflict that we're seeing today. Yeah, and so rather than trying to de-escalate the situation, the U.S. starts pouring billions of dollars into weapons and training for the Ukrainian military.
Wow.
So it's almost like they're preparing for this confrontation with Russia, even while they're publicly denying any such intentions.
That's a pretty bold move.
Yeah.
What was Putin's reaction to all of this?
Well, by late 2021, Putin has clearly had enough.
Okay.
He issues what's basically an ultimatum to the West.
Okay.
He says, halt NATO expansion or face the consequences. He sees NATO's encroachment on Russia's borders as an existential threat.
Right.
And he's determined to draw a line in the sand.
So how does the Biden administration respond to this ultimatum?
Essentially, they brush him off.
Wow.
They reiterate that NATO's open door policy is non-negotiable. They refuse to even consider Russia's security concerns. They dismiss them as being unfounded and a pretext for aggression.
So the U.S. is basically doubling down on its strategy.
Yeah.
Despite the pretty clear risks involved.
Yeah, and keep in mind, this is after decades of NATO expansion, closer and closer to Russia's borders, despite the promises made to Gorbachev back in 1990.
Yeah.
So you can imagine from Russia's perspective, they're feeling encircled. They're feeling like their concerns are being ignored, and they're seeing the West actively arming a potential adversary right on their doorstep.
It seems like this conflict was almost inevitable at this point.
It's hard to argue with that assessment.
Yeah.
And the real tragedy here is that even after the invasion in February 2022, there were still opportunities for a negotiated settlement.
Wait, are you saying that the war could have been stopped even after it started?
According to Sachs, yes.
Wow.
He believes that there is a real chance for peace early on.
Okay.
And this was being mediated by Turkey, which had been facilitating talks between Russia and Ukraine. And they were actually close to reaching an agreement.
Wow.
With the main sticking point being Ukraine's neutrality.
Okay, so Russia was demanding that Ukraine agree to remain neutral.
Exactly.
And not join NATO.
Right. And initially, Zelensky seemed open to that idea.
Okay.
It made sense strategically for Ukraine to avoid getting caught in this crossfire between Russia and the West.
Yeah.
And it could potentially even serve as a bridge between the two.
So what happened? Why didn't that happen?
Well, according to Sachs, both the U.S. and the UK intervened. They pressured Zelensky to reject the peace deal and to continue fighting.
Wow. So they encouraged them to keep going with the war.
Yeah. Boris Johnson even flew to Kyiv personally to deliver that message.
Wow.
He assured Zelensky of continued Western support and basically urged him to keep the war going.
So instead of encouraging a peaceful resolution, they pushed them to keep fighting, knowing full well that Ukrainian people would die.
And that's Sachs's interpretation of events.
Right.
He's very critical of this decision.
Right.
He argues that it's cost countless Ukrainian lives and led to immense suffering.
Yeah.
And he believes that the West, particularly the U.S., saw this conflict as an opportunity to weaken Russia, even if it meant sacrificing Ukraine in the process.
It makes you wonder whose interests are really being served in this conflict.
Absolutely.
So what about the sanctions? Weren't those supposed to cripple the Russian economy and force Putin to kind of back down?
Yeah. Sachs has a very interesting take on the sanctions.
Okay.
He argues that they've been largely ineffective in achieving their stated goals. In fact, he believes that they've actually backfired in some ways.
Really?
And hurt the West, particularly Europe, more than they've hurt Russia.
But I keep hearing about how much damage the sanctions are doing to the Russian economy.
Right.
How can you say that they've been ineffective?
Well, Sachs points out that Russia has been able to adapt and find alternative markets for its exports, particularly in Asia. China, India, other countries have stepped in to fill the void left by the Western sanctions.
So the sanctions haven't really isolated Russia.
Not necessarily. And Sachs goes even further. He argues that the sanctions have actually hurt Europe more than they've hurt Russia.
Wow, how so?
Because remember, Europe is heavily dependent on Russian energy, particularly natural gas.
Right.
And the sanctions have disrupted those energy flows, and that's led to skyrocketing energy prices, and that's caused economic pain for European citizens and businesses.
So it's like a classic case of unintended consequences.
Yeah.
It was meant to hurt Russia, but it ends up hurting the West as well.
Exactly.
Interesting. And Sachs also makes this point that the vast majority of the world has not joined the sanctions regime. Countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America, they've largely refused to take sides in this conflict.
Yeah, they're viewing it as a power struggle between the U.S. and Russia rather than this clear-cut case of good versus evil. And they see the hypocrisy in the West's, kind of selective outrage.
Right.
And they point to other conflicts where the U.S. has been involved, where sanctions have been notably absent.
So it's not just Russia that's kind of resisting this Western narrative about the war. It's much of the world.
Exactly.
And it seems like this conflict has really exposed a deep rift in the global order.
Absolutely.
It's about a shifting global power dynamic.
Yeah.
With the U.S. kind of struggling to maintain its dominance in the face of these rising powers like China and Russia.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so now we're starting to see how this fits into this much larger geopolitical picture.
Right, and I think that's really important to keep in mind as we try to make sense of this whole situation.
I totally agree. This has been a really eye-opening conversation, and I'm starting to see this conflict in a whole new light.
Yeah.
So if we step back and look at the big picture, what are the key takeaways here? What can we learn from all of this?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is that, conflicts like this, they don't just come out of nowhere. There's always a historical context. There's a series of events and decisions that create the conditions for war.
Yeah, it's like this slow-burning fuse that eventually ignites. And in this case, it seems like that fuse was lit decades ago with the end of the Cold War and the expansion of NATO.
Right.
And it seems like the U.S. played a pretty significant role in lighting that fuse by consistently ignoring Russia's security concerns, breaking promises, meddling in Ukraine's internal affairs.
Yeah, it's hard to deny that the U.S.'s actions, particularly its just unwavering support for NATO expansion, really contributed to this crisis. It's almost as if they were sleepwalking into a confrontation with Russia. They just didn't grasp or simply dismiss the potential consequences of their action.
And even after the invasion happened, when there was that chance for a negotiated settlement, it seems like the U.S. and the U.K. actively discouraged it. They pushed Zelensky to keep fighting.
Yeah.
And it's a really sobering thought that so much suffering could have been avoided if different choices had been made.
Absolutely. And it raises some really uncomfortable questions, I think, about the motivations of those in power. Is it really about protecting democracy and freedom, as we're so often told? Or are there these other less noble agendas at play?
It makes you wonder if the U.S. is truly committed to peace.
Yeah.
Or if they see this as an opportunity to advance their own geopolitical interests, even if it means Ukrainians are going to die as a result.
Yeah, it's a tough question to ask, but it's one that we need to be asking.
Absolutely.
And I think it highlights the importance of critical thinking.
Yeah.
Questioning the narratives that we're given, seeking out alternative perspective. We can't just blindly accept the official line. We need to dig deeper, consider the historical context, weigh the evidence for ourselves.
So how do we do that? How do we apply that critical thinking to this situation? Where do we go from here? I mean, if the goal is truly peace in Ukraine, what are the potential paths forward?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it's clear that the current approach of escalating the conflict through military aid and sanctions, it's not working.
Yeah.
It's only prolonging the suffering and increasing the risk of a wider war.
So what's the alternative? Is there a way out of this mess?
Well, Sachs argues that a peaceful resolution requires a really fundamental shift in mindset, both from the West and from Russia. The West needs to acknowledge its role in creating the conditions for this conflict and be willing to address Russia's security concerns.
So you're saying that the U.S. needs to be willing to compromise, to step back from its insistence on NATO expansion and accept a neutral Ukraine.
Exactly. It's a bitter pill to swallow, I think.
Yeah.
But it may be the only way to de-escalate the situation and create the space for a negotiated settlement.
Okay, and what about Russia?
Well, Russia, for its part, needs to recognize that, its invasion of Ukraine was a violation of international law. And that it's caused immense harm and suffering.
It sounds like a long shot, to be honest.
It's a daunting challenge for sure.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's impossible. Peace is always possible. But it requires a willingness to listen, to compromise, and to put human lives ahead of political agendas.
That's a powerful message.
Yeah.
And one that I think we all need to hear. This has been a truly eye-opening conversation. And I'm leaving with a much deeper understanding of this conflict.
I'm glad to hear that.
Any final thoughts you want to share with our listeners before we wrap up?
Just this. Knowledge is power. The more informed we are, the better equipped we are to make sense of the world around us, to challenge the status quo, and to advocate for peace.
I love that.
So keep asking questions. Keep seeking out diverse perspectives, and don't be afraid to challenge the narratives that are being fed to us.
Well said. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everybody.
We hope you've gained some valuable insights from this conversation. And a renewed appreciation for the importance of critical thinking.
Absolutely.
In these really challenging times.
Yeah.
So until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep striving for a more peaceful and just world.
Couldn't agree more.